Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Centered, a podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in the United States and the rise of powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico in the late 2000s, both countries appear to be moving toward a convergence of security interests, write Abelardo Rodriguez and Richard Kilroy in a research paper published earlier this month by the Baker Institute. In their paper titled Avoiding Conflict, United States and Mexico Future Security and Defense Scenarios, the authors suggest that after the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States and the continuous hostile rhetoric coming out of the White House against Mexico, the binational relationship is on a path toward divergence. What does the future of U.S.-Mexico relations as it pertains to security and defense look like in the decades to come? What are the key factors that determine which scenario is most or least likely to unfold? To answer these questions, I called Abelardo Rodriguez and Richard Kilroy. Abelardo Rodriguez Sumano is a professor and researcher in the Department of International Studies at Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, and a member of Mexico's National System of Researchers. He has written several books on the binational relationship between the United States and Mexico. Richard J. Kilroy is a non-resident scholar at the Center for the United States and Mexico and an associate professor of politics at Coastal Carolina University. He has written extensively on North American security, homeland security, and Latin America defense issues. Prior to entering academia, Kilroy spent 23 years on active-duty military service in the U.S. Army as a military intelligence and Latin America Foreign Area officer. Here's our conversation. Abelardo Rodriguez Sumano, professor at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, and Richard Kilroy, non-resident scholar at the Center for the United States and Mexico and associate professor at Coastal Carolina University. Thank you for accepting the invitation to be on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am excited to have this conversation with you. Recently, in fact, earlier this month, the Center published a research paper you wrote analyzing the state of security and defense of the United States and Mexico, paying attention to the relationship between these countries and trying to see what we can expect as we look ahead. And I got to say that I found the title a little surprising. You have this question, avoiding conflict, ? And I was just struck by the fact that for a long time, what we have seen in the U.S.-Mexico relationship in terms of security is convergence. Dealing with issues such as drug trafficking and illegal immigration, it seems like it's not just the economic future of these countries that depends on each other, but also their futures in terms of national security, as these are issues that affect both countries. And I'm not saying that the relationship it's been frictionless, not at all, right? But I'm kind of wondering what prompted this analysis, where you compare scenarios where in some cases there's conflict, even armed conflict. What do you see in the relationship that makes you think that maybe that's a possibility, or makes you, just do this analysis?
First off, the project actually began with the book project that Tony Payan and his colleagues at the center were putting together, and Abelardo and I worked together on that, and that book topic was actually the future of U.S.-Mexico relations, strategic foresight. It was actually looking towards the future, and we decided to focus on defense relationships, particularly looking at military-to-military relationships, and it tied into a lot of our previous relationship and working together. I've known Abelardo now for, I think, going on 16 years. We met at a Homeland Defense conference out in Colorado Springs, sponsored by U.S. Northern Command. But we pursued this topic and looked at it, and our previous research really looked at the topic of convergence, and we actually looked at it from a trilateral perspective initially, looking at U.S., Canada, and Mexico, with another one of our colleagues, Todd Hatley from the Royal Military College. And so that project started, about 16 years ago. We wrote a book together on trilateral security relations. And throughout the theme of our writing, we really looked at this topic of regional security complex theory and relationships between countries and forming a regional security complex. And a lot of our research was focused on the convergence that took place after 9/11, And then after Hurricane Katrina, there were other focusing events that did cause the U.S., Mexico, and Canada to work together more closely. And we tied it into the whole idea of the theory that was put together by Busan and Weaver and others that talked about regional security complex theory. And they have a number of variables that they went through. And so that was our initial research, was to look at the relationship between the three countries, focusing on that particular model or theory. And what's changed is, of course, what's happened more recently in the last couple of years with elections in the United States and elections in Mexico. And so that caused us to maybe relook at that theory, relook at some of our earlier analysis to say, we're in fact U.S., Mexico, and Canada having a convergence of security interest, or now were they actually diverging? And if so, what would that look like, 15, 20 years down the road if things don't change, if the politics of our two countries continue the way they are, if the leadership continues, what could be the possible scenarios that would come out of that? So I'll stop there and let Abelardo add his background as well.
Yes, I think exactly as you just mentioned, it was the Homeland Defense Symposium in 2004 in Colorado Springs where we met together, and there was a critical point in the U.S. history right after 9/11. There was a whole reorganization on Homeland Security, national defense, and national security. So from a Mexican perspective, it was clear and important how Mexico had a different role on the new context in the U.S. perspective after the 9/11. And from that, we started a dialogue, organizing conferences, writing papers, and traveling around Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. And we explored some other avenues from 19th century to the 20th century, up to the situation of Katrina, drug trafficking, and we have been studying the evolution of the trilateral relationship among Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and also, of course, between Mexico and the U.S. And in that perspective is exactly the perspective of convergence to divergence was clear with the inauguration of the Trump administration. So in that perspective is how we have been thinking and writing in this paper. And of course, this paper is part of a larger project under the Rice University led by Tony Payan. So based on that, I think the novelty of this project is to explore some tendencies on U.S.-Mexico relation, in the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. For the future, for the next 15, 20 years. This is a novel case since almost all the projects on U.S.-Mexico relationship have been dealing with the past on trade, drug trafficking, foreign policy, but not toward the future. So that's, I think, where in the case of Richard Kilroy and myself, work on security and military-to-military relations, and it has been very interesting to look at the future. I will leave it here.
So I think you kind of answered my next question, which was about the scope of the study in terms of time, right? You said you're looking at the next 15, 20 years and how what's happening now will affect that. You say that, and I quote, the U.S.-Mexico relationship experienced a dramatic change from convergence, which happened from 2001 to 2016, to divergence from 2017 and on, with the arrival of Trump to the White House in January 2017. Can you kind of just briefly say what this convergence was, right? You mentioned Katrina and 9/11, and what are the changes now that you see with Trump that make you think, okay, it's time to analyze what's the future in 15, 20 years?
I think from a Mexican perspective is that we experience this divergence, this gradual divergence in a new rhetoric, very aggressive towards Mexicans and towards Mexico. And we have identified a change in tone and a change in different policies. We take a look at different policies just since the beginning of the Trump administration. Those have to do with a new redefinition, but at the same time, it's a kind of continuation with border security, the wall, and linking the wall, immigration, with drug trafficking and terrorism. And in the center, from a Mexican perspective, from an American perspective, is that the most vulnerable sector on Homeland Security, U.S. Homeland Security is Mexico. So, of course, it has meant a major debate in Mexico about it. If this is just the beginning of a new possible invasion, conflict, political conflict, or even military conflict. So, previous to the AMLO administration, there was a major debate from different sectors in the Mexican armed forces, politicians, society, and even all of those actors that they were in favor of NAFTA, for example, about the integration and about the North American community. It was clear with the Trump administration there was a major dramatic change on that dynamic and tone.
Yeah, the scope of the study was again to do it in a futures foresight, which is the methodology that was used in the book project, or what I consider, coming from an intelligence background, since I spent time in the intelligence community, is to do strategic forecasting, which is to use certain analytical models to try to project scenarios that we might see in the future based on certain evidence or trends that we see, doing some trend analysis or looking at indicators and things like that. And so when we looked at this project and decided to apply a couple different analytical methodologies, one of them we decided to use was something called analysis of competing hypotheses. And in that methodology, it's used in the intelligence community not to necessarily prove a theory, but to try to disprove theories or find the least likely as opposed to the most likely scenario. And so when we looked at, projecting out 15, 20 years, we looked at a number of scenarios. We limited it to the four in this particular study. But one would be the status quo, which would have been before Trump, the convergence theory. Would that be the most likely scenario going forward? Or would it be some variation on this divergence theory, which is that maybe potentially that we would be more divergent in our security cooperation between the two militaries, between the two countries, or even to the extreme case of possible an actual military conflict occurring between Mexico and the United States. And so we took those scenarios and we took the methodology we used with the ACH and really looked at evidence of how that relationship might develop over the next 15 to 20 years. So, for example, the United States we have election on November 3rd. A lot, will probably hinge on whether, we see another 4 years of the Trump administration. If that's the case, then at least the assessment is that would also then trigger the possibility of more divergence as opposed to convergence in security relations. And then Abelardo can talk from Mexico's perspective of under AMLO and what would happen politically if he continued office or his successor continued similar policies.
With the arrival of the Andrés Manuel López administration, there was a lot of expectation or possibility of a kind of confrontation between both governments. Just based on the last trip from the Andrés Manuel López administration to Washington last month, it was clear that they are clear that it's better to have a very strategic relationship, very pragmatic relationship with the Trump administration. And it's clear that they are able or that they want to preserve the status quo. Doesn't matter who is in the White House, but they are very clear about that pragmatic vision. That's some kind of surprising from Mexican perspective, since Andrés Manuel López Obrador was vocal against Trump when he was a political candidate, before he was in Los Pinos, then or later the National Palace, and he has been very pragmatic. There's a continuation in that sense from different governments, from the governments of the Free, from the governments of the National Action Party, and there's a continuation and that dynamic. And his Minister of Foreign Relations, Marcelo Ebrard, he has been very cautious, and he's actually the current leader of foreign policy and national security. So they are clear that they want to preserve the status quo with the Trump administration. But that's not the case with the general public. That's not the case with the security sector, and even that's not the case among the armed forces. There are questions, there are doubts, there are reserves of what is the future of that, taking into account that the definition of borders in the U.S. is different. It's an elastic border. It's through history they have extended the border. So, and that's a crucial aspect from the national security and even defense approach of how the U.S. in more than 200 years, they have extended the limits of the border. And that's something that Rick and we have been discussing for years. And we know that there's a very sensitive, but I want to end this comment that at the high level, at the political level, there's a aggressive rhetoric from the White House, and in Mexico, it's clear that they want to keep that strategic relationship. But it's not the same among the society in Mexico about this pragmatic approach from the U.S. perspective.
So, according to your analysis, what is the scenario that is most likely to play out, or the least likely to play out?
Well, using the methodology, like I said, we compared those four scenarios, and one would be just traditional security relations would continue, and that would be actually we consider it would be the most likely. But again, the methodology is try to not support the most likely, but actually disprove the least likely. Mm-hmm. And in our case, the least likely one would have been military conflict. And Abelardo and I have a little bit of disagreement on that. He actually sees that is maybe a little more credible than probably I would, coming from a U.S. perspective, having served in the U.S. military. I can tell you that we don't have military contingency plans to go to war with Mexico. So of those scenarios, the analysis kind of pointed to that we would have traditional security relationships. The preferred scenario would be that we go back to maybe more convergence as opposed to a status quo. That what was building after 9/11, what happened after Katrina, when the Mexican military came to the support of the United States, sent Mexican military forces into Texas to provide disaster response relief. All those were signifying this further move towards a convergence of security interest, bilaterally, but also trilaterally, of course, with Canada. And so that's kind of where the paper goes, is if that's the preferred scenario, we would like to see more convergence and security cooperation with our countries, Mexico taking an increased role regionally as well. That scenario would require certain policy choices to be made by both administrations. And so that's what we go to in the paper, is to kind of lay out some policy recommendations on what we would hope both countries would do to move us more towards that direction. And personally, I mean, my perspective is that I think if, in fact, we did have a change in government with the elections this fall, with the administration of a Joe Biden as president, who was very active, obviously under Obama, when we saw a lot of these initiatives taking place after the Bush administration, was to push more towards looking for security cooperation, not just in the military sphere, defense relations, but looking at security from a much broader constructivist view, which is really what the Busan and Weaver theory that we look at in our regional security complex theory. And we saw that happen quite extensively under the Obama administration. Changes in the Merit Initiative, putting more emphasis on social development, law enforcement, those aspects, as opposed to direct military support, which was primarily emphasized during the Bush administration.
this type of analysis tries to explore different scenarios in the future. And from a Mexican perspective is that taking into account the U.S. role in the Western Hemisphere, taking into account the role of the U.S. in a global perspective, we cannot cancel the possibility of a military conflict as a possible scenario. That's where Rick just mentioned that we have some disagreement. From our perspective, it's important to take into account these other scenarios. It's important to look at this scenario since the U.S. has, even in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, we have had examples of the changes on tone and policies during the 19th century, 20th century. There are different kind of examples. It can be not only military conflict, it can be political conflict, it can be diplomatic conflict, it can be economic conflict, it can be border conflict. So to me, it's important to look at the possibility of a military conflict, even since the Trump administration or even the President Trump mentioned just in January of 2017 the possibility of invading Mexico. What else do we want? The Commander-in-Chief just mentioned and pointed out. Of course, that's a scenario. That's what we don't want. But we need to take into account this other divergence as a possibility scenario. Secondly, there's another possibility, taking into account the Mexican vulnerabilities, corruption, impunity, the advance of drug trafficking, and the possibility of that intersection between drug traffickers and terrorists trying to attack the U.S. in any of the points that we share along the U.S.-Mexican border. My point is that based on the Mexican vulnerabilities, it's possible to take into account this scenario where the U.S. will try to preserve its interests, taking into account that we share this border.
So lastly, I wanted to ask about how the outbreak and the spread of COVID-19 has perhaps made this relationship much more complicated, and whether it has led to convergence or more divergence under both the Trump administration and the López Obrador administration in Mexico.
Since we are so socially interdependent countries, where we exchange every kind of items between both countries, from people, from tourism, from telecommunications, transportation, it's clear now the center of more deaths now is in the U.S. and Mexico is third. So it will have in the following months and probably years implications on trade, security, and the border and the immigration. And is after the pandemic situation where we have the security component as a second major priority. The third one is TechMec, and the fourth one is the protection of the border.
So we'll have to see how then the pandemic evolves and what happens on November 3rd, because it will have certain important implications for the future of this U.S.-Mexico relationship. Abelardo Rodriguez Sumano and Richard Kilroy, thank you so much for answering these questions.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
That was Abelardo Rodriguez and Richard Kilroy. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Lisa Waqueta, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at usmexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, and Spotify. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. and we'll see you next time.